it all came down to um, the stamps that we wrote the article about, the stamps shown behind me. Um, I I happened to notice that I I thought in looking closely at the very small but highly detailed images in these stamps that the workers might have been black, plantation workers. And I brought this to the attention of Eric Jackson, who I've known for years, and he's he's sometimes a man of very few words, and he kind of said, I never noticed that before. Why don't you get in touch with Calvin? And he had just met Calvin at a stamp show. He thought that he might be interested in looking into these stamps. So via email, I got in touch with him, sent him some scans. He had just completed an exhibit for the National Postal Museum called Freedom Just Around the Corner. And that was all about Black history and the mails and revenue stamp usage. And he and the curator thought that they had found the earliest known examples of Black imagery on US stamps. And we're not talking about usage, just the sort of baseline criteria of Black imagery on US stamps. And they were, this happens to be a die proof of one of them, of what I thought might be a sharecropper. These stamps from 1868 are they were the focus of my collection when I started with Calvin. And I sent him scans of these two, and he said, yeah, we included these in the exhibit, and we thought that these 1868 stamps were the earliest depictions. And I was like, okay, well, what about these? And his reaction after he showed my scans to the curator, he wrote back and said that they were both crestfallen because they thought that they had found the earliest example for the exhibit, and it was their they agreed that the 1864 inspector stamps might be an earlier depiction. So this started our collaboration on trying to in some respects, just looking at these stamps, you could say, well, who was working on tobacco plantations in the time of the Civil War? It was predominantly, if not exclusively, Black people and enslaved Black people at that. But it was another thing to try to prove it. And that's one of the things that took 4 years of research to accomplish. And we did that by, looking at all the different elements in the vignettes. One of the things that we didn't write about in the article was we spent quite a bit of time trying to research the origin of the vignettes, because it was the practice of banknote engravers, per my understanding, that they rarely ever used original artwork for a vignette or for the subject of a stamp. Most of the time, even to the earliest postage stamps, the engravings of Washington were based on an existing piece of artwork, or a painting or an engraving or a sculpture. So we felt that there was sufficient detail in these vignettes that it wasn't just the work of a stamp designer who might have had some familiarity with tobacco production during that time to sort of come up with these illustrations, as a figment of their imagination. There's just way too much detail. Oh, that's great. Yeah, there's just
this is the
way too much detail.
from the AP article.
Right. And it's not if you could zoom in, uh, like the maximum amount on
Yeah,
this.
I will. Tell me where you want.
Just right there. Okay,
Okay.
perfect. Okay, that's well, even there, it's a little small, but um, on the image, so the right panel where you see barrels on a cart,
Mm-hmm.
um, and the cart's heading out of town. Uh, when you really zoom into this, you can see that behind the barrel there's a driver with a buggy whip, and that level of detail just seemed a bit too much for someone to come up with had they not been intimately familiar with tobacco production on a plantation during the Civil War. Um, yeah, that's great. So the right panel, which is on the right, you
Mm-hmm.
can see there's a cart. There are two barrels on the cart, hogsheads as they're called, and to the right of the second barrel, there looks sort of like an upside down V, and that is a buggy whip, or I guess this would be a, you know, uh, for getting the mules to move forward.
Right.
And um, all kind, there's so much, there's so much detail in here. We just figured, okay, where did this come from? And unfortunately, we were not able to ascertain that. Um, our thinking was that if we could figure out where the original artwork came from, and we could pin it down to an artist and a specific location, then perhaps by doing that, we could then say, okay, this was painted by or engraved originally for, let's just say, Harper's Weekly, and the engraver was such and such, and he was an American artist, and we wanted to be able to attribute an artist, a publication, so that we could definitively say that this was an American scene, but we couldn't do that. So instead, what we did was we analyzed all the different elements of the scene, contacted a bunch of different tobacco experts, including one gentleman who was an expert in tobacco buildings of the period. Uh, and so this is why in the article we never specifically said, and we did this intentionally, that this was an American scene. This is suggestive of uh, a scene from the U.S. in some respects, but we couldn't nail it down specifically. But what we could do quite accurately was determine that this was a scene of enslaved Black people. And there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, if the stamp was produced as when would the first one be? I've been writing about this stuff and researching it for so long, and I don't remember the details unless I look at my notes.
Right. Right. Sure.
But I believe the earliest that this stamp would have appeared would probably been, I believe, September of 1864. So let's say that an artist for American Phototype, perhaps familiar with tobacco production, rendered the scene off the top of his head out of his imagination. It would have to be a scene just by default of enslaved Black people, because again, through our research, we determined that the predominant workforce on tobacco plantations were Black. And we can't go by the complexion of any of the figures in these scenes, but what we could do was determine by the dress um, that they were, uh, it was further substantiation that they were Black workers, and that comes by way of the women depicted in the scene. So number two, the lady with the legend number two, she's wearing head wrap and a dress, and so is the lady number 1 and number 3 in the top panel, and in the bottom panel you have 4, 5, and 6, and you can tell that their dresses pretty clearly, even in American Phototype's wonderful printing, which wasn't so wonderful, but those details do come across. So that once we were able to establish that the rest of the story, the rest of our research focused on who produced them, how they were produced, for how long, et cetera, et cetera. So we feel that we were able to determine without a doubt that these are Black people depicted in these stamps, and thus they represent the earliest known depiction of not necessarily African Americans, but enslaved Black people on a U.S. stamp.
So you and Calvin are on opposite sides of the country. You're in LA and he's in the DC area. So how did so this took what, 4 years to do all the research?
It took about 4 years.
Right.
Did everything via email, phone. I didn't even really know. I never bothered to research online for a picture of him. So I never knew I didn't know what he looked like. It was only this past December that I decided to take a trip to Washington to do research at the archives, because I'm writing a book on. It actually doesn't touch on the level of detail about these stamps that the article does. It's about the first. It's an overview of the first 3 issues of Inspector Stamps.
Right.
And so to fill in gaps in my research, I took this trip to DC, and he doesn't live all that far from the archives in College Park. So we finally met, and he joined some of my research sessions in the textual division era, and it was so email, phone call, and there were a couple of times where he was in the Smith, because he used to be an assistant curator for the National Postal Museum until mid last year. And while he was there and he was looking through the archives for material that might be relevant to our research, he would sometimes take pictures on his phone and text them to me. So this was very much 21st century research on 19th century material.
Right. Speaking of research, before we started, you put your screen up and you showed me a chart that you guys had worked off of. Can you put that up?
Sure.
I think people would be interested in seeing that.
Okay, let's see here. Let me do this. Okay, does everybody see a flow chart?
Yep.
Okay.
Blow it up a little bit more. You went.
I went small. I just wanted
to show you to do it. Okay.
So once we thought, so this is now, this chart is about 4 years old. Once we thought we had there was some meat on the bone for this research, we were also discussing the idea of having an exhibit at the Smithsonian National Postal Museum. So I came up with this flow chart that basically outlined every possible angle of research that I thought we should engage in. So I'm not going to go through this in detail. It's not necessary and probably really boring, but this box in green, tax laws and regulations, it all started with the tax laws put in place in July of 1864, where cigars were required by law, by act of Congress, to be packaged very specifically in either boxes, bundles, or packages, and inspected by specifically cigar inspectors who were mandated by this new legislation, and to have stamps attached to the cigar packaging once it was inspected. And inspection involved um, ascertaining the amount of tax due on each individual bundle, package, or box of cigars. So it all started with the tax laws and regulations, which led to the creation of the inspector stamps. Um, and yeah, so, okay, over here it says write or find synopsis of tax laws. So that took a little bit of time. It wasn't hard to find the laws. It took a minute to get used to reading them and figuring out what they meant. So the tax laws and regulations led to the creation of the inspector stamps. And then, as was the case with postage stamps and with the very first issue of regular revenue stamps, I thought that the Internal Revenue Service might have, or the Office of the Commissioner of Internal Revenue, to be more specific, would have um, placed an ad in newspapers, as was the custom, looking for a stamp printer. And I could not find one. So it was easy enough. It was incredibly easy just to go on online and look at digitally archived old newspapers and find the ads placed by the commissioner's office for the creation of the first issue documentary and proprietary stamps. But I could not find one for making cigar stamps.
Hmm.
And I thought that was a little bit strange. In fact, I thought it was very strange, because all other, again, it's you read in the philatelic literature, you go online, you look for them, and you can find the government classified ads seeking what were called proposals for designs for new issues of postage and revenue stamps.
Right.
Then, as part of the research, I found this newspaper article announcing an award of a contract to American Phototype, but I could not find the solicitation for it. So that led me to think that somehow a direct or a private arrangement was made between the Commissioner of Internal Revenue and American Phototype, and that's pretty much what ended up happening. So, and then there were, let's see. So then I found an article, actually, one of our research assistants found an article from 1893, I think it was, in which the author transcribed 4 American Phototype contracts with the government. And the earliest of those cigar stamp contracts mentioned a previous contract, which I could not find anywhere. And so it was so where is that other contract? Why wasn't that part of this article from 1893 transcribing American Phototype contracts with the government? So there were all these little mysteries that popped up, that I sought to answer, and I eventually sort of what's the word? I extrapolated how these stamps came to be produced, and that's what I'm writing about in this book. And then there was the designing of the stamp. You can see here, this was the part of our research, source of original artwork. That was our holy grail. We wanted to try to ascertain a geographical location, who the artist might have been. Another one of the mysteries of American Phototype, and subsequently part of this research, was trying to figure out if we could find information on who worked for them, who their artists were, and that that course of research came up blank as well. Just like with the Continental Banknote Company, who records of who worked on what are essentially lost.
Hmm.
That information just does not seem to want to be found with respect to the people who worked for American Phototype as artists or as stamp designers. The only person that we were able to associate with them was James Duthie. He was an engraver who used to work for the National Currency Bureau, which was the predecessor of the Bureau of Engraving and Printing. And he went to work for American Phototype as their general manager, but there's just no record of who designed their stamps. So these were some of the questions that we sought to answer. And so, without going into further detail about this, these were all the different angles we sought. And unfortunately, the exhibit never happened because Calvin left his employee at the museum, but our exhibit, in effect, turned into the article for the APS journal. So
Great.
Yeah, that's an overview of this. So this basically took 4 years to figure out. It took an afternoon to put this together and 4 years
Right.
to try to figure out. And it was, as these things are, an absolute labor of love. And we had some just wonderful discussions, not just about stamp productions, but stamp production, and both marveling at how hard it was to find certain kinds of information, and having our eureka moments where we discovered something new and were overjoyed to find the information. But we also had some very, very interesting conversations about race. And Calvin is Black and had a perspective on the appearance of Black imagery that I was just unaware of. And I think I walked out of this research having a much better understanding of what we're actually looking at when we see Black people pictured on these early tobacco stamps, and not just the inspector stamps, but the later stamps of 1868, which have let me stop the sharing here, which have much more, I guess you could say, conspicuous imagery. The imagery is much just much larger and more detailed, as you can see to the if you could scroll left to those Continental Banknote Company stamps.
Hold on a second. Is my screen up? I'm having a little difficulty here.
I'm seeing your screen.
Okay, and everybody else should.
We see Tom.
Okay.
Oh, and by the way, that cigar box that's pictured there, before I get into the other stamps, it may just kind of look like some ratty old cigar box with a stamp on it, but I cannot begin to tell you all how incredibly rare that thing is. To find one of these stamps on piece, scarcer than hen's teeth, harder to find in a needle in a haystack. And one of the wonderful things about this research was that it put me in touch with experts in the tobacco field, including the very colorful Tony Hyman, who is probably the leading expert in period cigar boxes. And we had some amazing conversations. He's a very interesting guy, and he happens to have some of the rarities of cigar boxes that featured the very stamps that we were talking about. So even though it's kind of small and it looks kind of old and beat up, that thing is a gem. And if I had that in my collection, I would feel that my collection was complete, because having an example on piece is just so hard to come by. But to the left are the later Continental Banknote Company stamps. These are tobacco stamps that were placed on larger packages of better grades of smoking tobacco. And the reason I determine that is simply by the fact that it says class 32 cents. And all that means is that the taxes that are represented as being paid by these stamps were on tobacco that was manufactured by in such a way that the stems were removed. So apparently, if the leaf stems are included in the tobacco, it's not as high a quality of product. Those were taxed at 16 cents per pound. The tobacco leaf without stems was taxed at 32 cents per pound. So these were for the better grade of tobacco. And one of the stamps that got me really interested in this whole field is the one that's it's the 5-pound stamp that's on the bottom there. If you could scroll, yeah, you could scroll. Okay. So, and this ties into what I was saying about perspective. So on one hand, I've for some reason, I can't explain why. It's just one of those things about stamp collecting. You latch onto things and you like them. I loved this vignette. I loved the way it was executed. I liked all the detail in it. I like the fact that the cornflower is in the foreground, and the man is behind it. I just like the perspective. I liked it as a piece of art. And I felt, and so we're now talking 4 years ago, I originally felt that this was almost like a commemorative, like it seemed to me a noble portrayal of this man's labor. And his eyes are clearly defined. I thought maybe he was a free man, maybe, because he's wearing an earring. And I thought that maybe that was a sign of affluence, or as affluent as possibly a sharecropper could be. He's depicted wearing an earring. It's very, very distinct. And so this was my perspective at the time. And later I'll share my screen. Actually, I'm just going to do this real quick now.
Yeah, I'll stop my.
Okay.
My share.
Let me just show where this is. This is all going somewhere, folks.
I think everyone's enjoying it. This is really a fascinating discussion.
Okay. Oh no, I don't.
No, don't leave.
Okay. Which screen let me see. Oh, there we go. Okay.
Yeah, it says you're sharing.
All right. Can you see these close-ups?
Yes.
Okay. So this is a blow up on the right here is a blow up of this die proof, which comes from Mark Tomasco, who is a collector of the guy who provided the illustrations that were eventually rendered into these engravings. And it's pretty distinct, this round thing that's not just his earlobe, that's an earring. It seems to have translated pretty nicely to this smaller version of this man's head, which was used in a ½ ounce. So this stamp, this is a stamp that would have been put on a ½ ounce of this finer smoking tobacco. And again, it translated very well. Where else? You can also see it in this die proof. Actually, this scan is a little bit hazy, but it's there. And the illustrator of the original artwork that was used for this vignette was Felix Octavius Carr Darley, FOC Darley. And he was the foremost illustrator of for books, and also banknote engravings and scenes to be put on checks as anti-counterfeiting devices. This is another piece of his artwork in which a violinist, he sketched these um, two portraits of Tony Washington, who was apparently a very colorful, well-known guy in New York, a violinist. And again, he's depicted with earrings. So, and then I'm going to go up here and show this painting by William Sidney Mount, 1856. Again, musician, being shown wearing an earring. So the question in my mind arose: do these earrings, do they suggest some sort of affluence? What do they mean? And when we came across this picture of the by Mount, it was a bit of a eureka moment for us, because we thought that for our next article, where we are going to talk about the 1868 stamps, we might talk about the earring. And I said to Calvin, I'm marveling at the and I'm a musician, so I extra appreciate seeing somebody in the process of playing something, especially in a 19th century painting.
Mm-hmm.
He's not a caricature. He's dressed well. He's in the moment. If you saw this painting zoomed in, there's such clarity in the way the eyes are represented. The proportions are great. And Calvin then started to correct me, and he said, yeah, it's really well done, but he's in a box. He's in the typical, he doesn't look like a caricature, but this is absolutely a stereotype.
Mm.
And so I was like, what do you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Here I am all enthralled with this painting. He goes, look, back in the day, African Americans were depicted in artwork by white artists in the stations in life that white people wanted to see black people in. Yes, it's a really well done painting. Yes, his expression is priceless. It's wonderfully done, but it was specifically designed to show an African American in a stereotypical station in life. And so it looks good, but it's literally showing a man in a box. He is in a cage. He's in the cage that white people want to see a man like him in. And I was taken aback by this at first, because it just, here I am being all art history appreciative and loving what I'm seeing, and he's like, no, what you're seeing, there's a whole other layer of subtext behind this painting and behind these other depictions of the earring in black men in 19th century paintings. As it turns out, there was a certain level of exoticism that was embodied in these illustrations. And that was the thing, these little details, this little earring was just enough exoticism to make these images appeal to white people, to a white audience. And so we had many discussions about this, and it kind of rocked my world, but woke me up to what art is actually portraying. There is this whole other level of subtext here, which I think is extremely important to recognize. So we go back to this, my favorite stamp, and what I thought was a noble portrayal of a man's labor. And it turns out that once again, this is a man in a cage. This is a man and the workers behind him, depicted as white people would find acceptable. And that's so this story didn't have a happy ending for me, but it's fine. You know, it took me a minute to get used to the different perspective, but I'm glad to have the perspective now and not go the rest of my life, you know, just sort of naive about what I'm looking at here. And I think it's a very valuable perspective to have on these stamps. They are what they are, but they're not what they seem. Fortunately, however, you know, we do have these wonderful images of, you know, a reminder, a sad reminder, but, you know, they're well done images of stamps of Black people on these stamps. And even though it's not the most happy timeline, it at least extends the timeline of Black history on U.S. stamps further back than we might have imagined.
How's it going with you?
That's great, Peter. Does anyone have any questions for Peter? Unmute your mic and ask away.
Hi, Peter. This is Charlene. I just want to thank you for diving deeper. I also know Calvin and had an opportunity to go to the exhibit that was at the National Postal Museum. But before, and that was a really nice exhibit. So it would have been nice to see this, you know, take it a little deeper. But it's good to add to, you know, we always say Booker T. Washington, 1940. Then there's that big break before, you know, we really start with the Black Heritage series. But this research points out, you know, that we can go back further. I think the first time I really started looking at stamps for something different too was I think it was the 1865 with the Civil War stamps where the soldiers were standing at a cannon, I think it was. And I would have missed that just by the title, because it's easy when you're looking for the name, an African-American name. But right now I'm adding to my collection, you know, African-American related type stamps. So this is definitely something to, you know, help you start really paying attention to those little background pictures. But thanks for your research.
Oh, my pleasure. It's glad to have the opportunity to present this subject, and I know I speak for Calvin as well. And by the way, Ron, I see Ron Lesher. It's good to see you, Ron. Ron,
Thank you, Peter. Let me add one comment, Peter, and that is cigarette stamps. We think of today, at least, the usual way of consuming tobacco is through cigarettes. Cigarettes as a manufactured product, that is with a paper wrapper as opposed to a tobacco leaf wrapper, which would be cigars, don't come about until much later. And so when you're talking about manufactured tobacco and fine tobacco, this very well may have been used to roll one's own as opposed to using it in a pipe. It could have been used in a pipe as well, but I rather suspect at that period of time, these were for roll your own cigarettes.
That's the impression I'm under as well. Yeah, there was in 1864 or 65, the Congress was in this habit of changing the tobacco taxes every year. So in 1864, they mandated they not only changed the tobacco rates from what they were, the tobacco tax rates from what they were, but they mandated the use of stamps on cigar boxes. I think it was in 1865 that cigarettes, or paper cigarettes, as they were described in the commissioner's writing, were supposed to be taxed. There was a specific tax on them, but there was a question as to whether or not the cigar strips had to be placed on that packaging. And then in let me just show this. This was the very first. I mean, they're big. They're. This was the very first type of cigar strip produced in 1864. One of the things that I'm going to say most people don't know, because my book hasn't come out yet, but I did have a chance to present these stamps at a talk at the Southern California Collectors Club last month. These were the first issue. They're pretty crudely printed. So these came first, and then the second issue stamps. But these stamps were produced by the U.S. government. So now you are one of maybe 3 dozen or 4 dozen people who now know this. These first issue stamps are not listed with a printer in the Springer catalog, which is where you find these things listed. Neither are these, and neither are these. These are the third issue stamps. So you look in the Springer catalog and you get all these details about the stamps themselves, but not a listing of who actually printed them. As it turns out, these were printed by the U.S. government starting in July of 1864. And it's not exactly clear why, but as of September 1864, the government stopped making these and contracted American Philatelist to make the second issue stamps. So, and another thing that was kind of hard to resolve in the research was these stamps are listed in the Springer catalog as being an issue of 1863, but there was no tax legislation in 1863 that mandated the use of cigar stamps on cigar boxes. So that was it turned out to be a huge red herring. I'm spending all this time trying to figure out, did I just miss something in the tax laws? And reading tax law is not easy. Pages and pages and pages and pages in the language that they were written in. Did I miss something, or was Springer incorrect? And who am I to say that Springer was incorrect? But turns out Springer was incorrect. So you got 1864 first issue, produced only for a couple of months, and then second issue also 1864. And then in 1865, when the tax laws were changed, the cigar tax rates were changed again. American Philatelist was again brought on board to produce these third issue stamps. And there are plenty of mysteries surrounded with the production of these as well. So that's been one of the great things about this research, is finding all these mysteries and trying to resolve them. I'd like to find this one thing and show it to you. Just give me 1 second.
Question: when you mentioned about the young man that had the earring on, I thought I read somewhere where sometimes that was used as with jewelry, and things were used by slave owners to identify their slaves, or to say who.
That's interesting. It's the first I'm hearing of it. Calvin has done more research on that than me. I will mention that to him, and see if that rings any bells with him. It's the conclusion that we've come to without knowing that kind of information is that they were basically invented for use in illustrations of black males for this for purposes of making them look a little more exotic. Exoticism is something that seems to be associated with tobacco products, especially if you look at some of the tobacco box labels, where either black women or Middle Eastern looking women, or some sort of exotic. There's always something exotic or over the top about the figures used to illustrate tobacco advertising labeling. But that's a very interesting perspective. I'll mention that to Calvin.
Your 1865 cigar stamps by Phototype. I believe that's the second illustration of Lincoln on a stamp. Again, much earlier than he was portrayed on a postage stamp.
Yes.
The first one is the 5-cent revenue stamp paper, and I have seen, I don't own, but we have seen the approval of that, and that it was approved, if I remember correctly, at the end of May 1865, barely 6 weeks after the death of Lincoln. So the notion of using the martyred president on revenue stamps comes about very, very quickly.
Yes. I believe that the American Phototype contract to produce the third issue. I'm going to share my screen so you can see. Their contract to produce these stamps was March, April, May 5th. It was dated May 15th, 1865. So are you, Ron, are you familiar with the contracts, or do you know of contracts for American Phototype's production of the Type P revenues?
I have never seen those, no.
Okay. The contract for these I found in the same article that I from 1893. That's how I know the date.
Okay.
One of the Okay, so what we're looking at here, try to do two things at once here. What we're looking at here is these are two trial color proof sheets mounted to a larger piece of paper. These were discovered as part of this research. Let me see if I can blow this up a little bit. In the archives at the National Postal Museum. So this is one of the things that Calvin sent me photos of from his cell phone, because he was there. He called me up. He's like, "Hey, I'm at the archives, and I want to look for some stuff." I'm like, "Well, see if there are any proofs or essays of this." And he texted me later and said, "What do you think of this?" So apparently, this has never been in the public view before. So I'm happy to present it here. These are trial color proofs of these stamps. Again, American Phototype. These are in a greenish, and then you have these in black. And the design it's sort of odd, but they do feature Lincoln's portrait. the only stamp that was ever produced in green was the 500 denomination. So these are strange as trial color proofs, because this one has 3 trial colors for 3 denominations and the actual issued color of 1, and the same with the black. The 500 was never issued in black. And here's another mystery. There's a 5th denomination of 250 cigars. And so it's not represented in these trial color proof sheets. I've since gotten in touch with a lot of the tax paid collector rock stars, who, if anybody's got these stamps, they would have it, and none of them have a copy of the 250 cigar value. So, when did it get produced? Why isn't it part of this proof set? It's just another one of those mysteries.
The way of researching that is to look at the annual reports of the, I'm trying to remember, I believe it's the, well, I don't remember whether it's the Commissioner of Internal Revenue annual reports, but there are month by month what was actually delivered to them and sent out to district collectors, and it's that source that there are some errors in that report, by the way, because they report that there was a delivery in, I believe, April of 1865 of revenue stamp paper, and of course that precedes the proofs that we have seen that actually have the approval date on them after that. And I believe that April should in fact be June, not April. I've written about that. I believe there's an article in with the U.S. Stamp Society, I believe is where that was actually written.
Is that the one you did with Bill Ainsworth?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I know it. I know the article.
But other than that, we have monthly deliveries of revenue stamp paper in those, whatever the source was. It's not coming to the surface right now.
I didn't know that there were reports that were that detailed. Those I'd like to see at some point. This is the kind of thing that really gets me going, by the way, hearing little, well, not so little, but hearing about, information that's available that can shed more light on things.
They contain information.
Well,
they contain information by and large that corrects some of our other that have corrected some of our other misconceptions. For years, the type O that is illustrated, the 2-cent coin was attributed to a firm in St. Louis, and those annual reports clearly indicate that it was Morey and Sherwood of Chicago, and their deliveries were only over a period of about 3 months.
Ah.
And that comes from those same annual reports, Peter.
And those are Commissioner? Those are IRS?
I think, yes, I believe that's correct. When I worked for the New Jersey Department of Education, the state library was 2 buildings away from where I worked, and I spent many lunch hours over there, and they had a complete collection on microfiche.
Oh.
So that was terrific. I believe 65 may be the first that's readily available, by the way, of those annual reports.
Okay. Those, at some point I would love to see those.
That might that might be also a place where you could see that that first issue was produced by the government as opposed to American Phototype as well, because they indicate who printed these various things, where they came from.
Okay, I found.
What is that, George?
Let me see if I can.
Stamp. Zoom.
Nice.
American.
I'm just getting something up here. I found corroboration of the. Here we go. Of who printed those stamps in the first issue stamps when I went to Washington and looked in the archives. I found the actual invoices.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to get up a picture of one now. Just taking me a second. And for those of you who may not have done a lot of philatelic research, I have to tell you that there is a certain indescribable joy of going to a library or the archives. All right, here we go. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see here. Let's see what, this one here. Is this it? All right. Are you seeing an old document on the
Yep.
left?
Yep.
Okay. So this is one of the documents that I found in this old book of thick book, all onion skin paper, very fragile, had to be handled literally with kid gloves. And this is an invoice from the National Currency Bureau to the Internal Revenue Bureau for the printing of the very first issue cigar stamps.
Very good. Yep.
And you know, it's one thing to see a picture of these. By the way, if it looks out of focus, it's actually not. The ink has spread into the paper over time. So this is actually an in focus photograph, but you can see here there's an order for printing $28,003 cigar stamps in green, and there's just a certain indescribable joy of running across these things. I expected to find this. From my research, I was thinking there have to be invoices, and then to be leafing through these books and actually finding it. It's not just a pat on the back. It's like, oh my God, this still exists, and this corroborates the existence of these stamps. And it's a great feeling. It's also a great feeling just to handle the paper. And anybody can go to the archives or just like a library and request the book and get it and handle these things yourself. It's a great feeling. And I love the fact that it says your composition per stamp 0.2 days at, now this is illegible. I've looked at this for forever now and I cannot make out what this says, but 0.2 days for a total charge of, I think that's 15 or 1580. And to a certain extent, the fact that it took 0.2 days to compose the design of this stamp makes a lot of sense because it's really, really crudely done. It's all composed with letterpress type, which is this is just a piece of printing type, but basically it was assembled by taking a whole bunch of little pieces of type and putting them in a row and coming up with these very crude stamps. So it always sort of puzzled me. Why would the government make a stamp that is this crude? And the reason is because the Commissioner of Internal Revenue was responsible for having these made, and he literally was given no time to get them done. The law that mandated the use of these stamps was passed on June 30th, 1864, and it went into effect the next day. So the commissioner had to, and cigar inspectors, same thing. On June 30th, there were no cigar inspectors. On July 1st, there had to be cigar inspectors. So the commissioner, if ever a commissioner of Internal Revenue could be considered a hero, I would consider J.J. Lewis, second IRS commissioner, to be a hero, because he managed to get these stamps done, 5 different denominations, printed in 5 different colors, get all the paperwork printed and out to cigar inspectors so that the government could start collecting taxes on the manufacturer of cigars, those taxes going to fund the Union War effort. And so now we come to the second issue, cigar stamps. And what makes them ironic is that they depict a scene of slavery, which is the very thing that the Civil War was being fought to abolish. So there's a delicious irony in the imagery in these stamps, aside from their historical connotations.
So Peter,
But,
you know, when we started this, when you asked me how long these things go, I told you an hour, and I don't know if you've been looking at the clock, but we're about 7 minutes over an hour. So this has been a really enlightening conversation, and I'm wondering if perhaps there might be a part 2 that we can talk about for next week if you have some time.
Sure. There's no shortage of stuff to talk about.
Yeah.
Not even. I mean, I could talk about the 1868 stamps and that imagery, or could talk about these. These are counterfeits of the second.
Right. Well, people love to talk about the counterfeit stuff too. So so let's save that. Let's save that and set up another session for next week. Really appreciate you spending the time today. It was a fabulous conversation. And so we're going to wrap this one up. We have another chat today, tonight at 7 o'clock with Gary Lowe. I hope that everyone joins us then. And again, thank you very much. And we look forward to connecting again. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having me. Great to see everyone. Thank you.
Have a good afternoon.
Peter.
You too. Bye-bye.